So myth number 5. So myth number 5 in that article is this, that we know absolutely nothing about the formation of the King James Version. Judging from what you've told me so far, it sounds like this is beyond false. What can you say about that?
I guess I should say there's two different views on the formation of the King James. We could call them the pessimistic view and the optimistic view.
Okay.
And some people take this sort of pessimistic view that we basically don't know anything, and others take this optimistic view that we actually know quite a bit. Not as much as we'd like to, but we know quite a bit. In my experience, where I run into that pessimistic view is primarily when I'll say something that someone might perceive as degrading the King James or correcting the King James. Right. And the immediate response that I get in a lot of cases is, there's no way to know that. All the records have been lost. We don't know how it was created. And there's this like cloud of mystery that hangs over people's heads. It's actually a kind of, you can almost call it selective skepticism. Like normally I'm fine with saying we know lots, the King James translators did good, but the moment you suggest anything negative, oh, well, we don't know how it was done.
We gotta leave that wiggle room in there.
Yeah, you know, all the records were lost.
Yeah.
One form that I've seen suggests that in the Great Fire of London in 1666, this massive fire that swept across London, all the records were destroyed there, which is really just this sort of romanticized idea. If the records did perish, and we know that some did, most of them were probably lost in a much, much earlier fire. But yeah, it creates this romantic idea that, oh, there was this fire, it swept across London, and now we don't know anything about the King James Bible. And I would just want to challenge that and say, it's true. We don't know as much about the King James Bible as we would like. We don't have as much information as we wish we did. There's certainly still some gaps in our knowledge. And there are good scholars working right now to fill those gaps as they work on new documents and new documents being discovered. But let me just kind of run through real quickly some of what we do have.
Sure. Let's
manuscripts. It's actually kind of fascinating. We talked about how the King James translators divided into 6 different teams. And when we found Bode 1602, that gave us work from 4 different teams at least. And then we talked about manuscript 98. And then recently, just a few years ago, Geoffrey Miller discovered Samuel Ward's personal translation of the Apocrypha, which gives us today, what that means is we have extant draft work, not just from 1 or 2 or 3 of those teams. We actually have extant draft work that covers text that was assigned to all 6 of those teams. That's actually astounding. You don't have anything like that for any other English Bible from the period. For any English writer like Shakespeare. David Norton talks about comparing the sources that we have today to Shakespeare scholars, and he basically says, man, a Shakespeare scholar would give their right arm or leg to have the kind of draft work of one of Shakespeare's plays that we have for so much of the King James Bible. So we now have draft work from text assigned to all 6 companies. We also have, from the work of William Craig, 16 contemporary accounts of the Hampton Court Conference, where the proposal for the translation was first made. So we're not talking about just one source. We're talking about 16 different people that were in that age that talk about what took place and how. We still have the copy of the bill that Barker gave to the king for those 40 unbound bishops' Bibles. We have loads of correspondence about the translation. This was the bill for those 40 copies. The king said, hey, they're going to revise the bishop's Bible, so they need copies of the bishop's Bible to work with, and they bought 40. And you might think, well, wait, how can 40 copies be spread among 50 people? But again, remember, they're only working on a small selection of the text. Each company is only working on one part of their selected text. So that's actually way more copies than would be needed. And then they get parceled out. But yeah, so we have loads of data there about how it was done. We have letters written back and forth about the translation, including some really important ones by Richard Bancroft and by King James, like the 2 men that were most in charge of creating this process as they're writing back and forth to each other. And then Bancroft writes to some bishops and clergy. So all kinds of personal correspondence that gives us details about the translation. We also have several copies of the rules that were created. I'm actually working right now on creating kind of a sort of semi-critical edition of those rules, but we've got maybe a half dozen copies that still exist today of those rules in several different stages as they were being added to and changed. We've got several lists of the translators that show us who was originally planned to work. We even have in recent years, one guy that wrote on the materials and methods pointed out, we have slips from the library showing the translators checking out stuff and noting this is to help with the work on the new translation. So we have their library receipts of books that they checked out. Yeah, I mean, just a fascinating amount of knowledge. More recently discovered, we have John Boyce's notes that he took during that general meeting. He was the only one that took notes that we know of. But during that general meeting in 1610, he recorded a lot of notes, and those have actually been printed by Ward Allen. Anybody that wants to dig in and buy, highly recommend. That's cool. He gives a beautiful copy where he provides, this is the way a facsimile should be done. He provides a picture on one page and then his transcription on the other page. I wish some of the other documents had been transcribed that way, but yeah, so you can still read through his notes as he records some of the changes that were made. We also recently discovered his annotated Septuagint, so his personal copy of the Septuagint that he kept notes in about the translation of their work. That's currently being studied right now.
Did they refer to the Septuagint when doing the Old Testament?
Oh, absolutely.
I didn't know
they
that.
made use of it on a pretty regular basis. Yeah,
wow.
The Septuagint was held in pretty high esteem. If you read the translators to the reader that Miles Smith writes in the front, it gives a really good assessment of their understanding of scholarship on the Septuagint at the time. And it wouldn't completely align with what scholars today have learned and said. There's been growth and change. But it's funny, I do find a lot of people today that will deny that the Septuagint exists, or that it could have been used, that it had anything to do with the King James, or that it had anything to do with the apostles quoting and using that type of thing. But if you read the preface, Miles Smith is really clear in his understanding of the Septuagint, how it was used by Jesus, how it was used by the apostles, what that means for how a translation can be flawed, but still be God's word. And then they talk about their use of it and their recourse made to it. So yeah, it's absolutely a resource that they value very, very highly.
That's really interesting.
One last thing I'd mention, we have Samuel Ward's report that I mentioned earlier to the Synod of Dort. And there's actually been a critical edition published just a couple of years ago. The Acta from the Synod of Dort were published basically in two different forms. There's a kind of a short form and a long form. We now have a critical edition of both. But even beyond that, in the papers of Samuel Ward that were dug through a few decades ago, we found his handwritten draft of that report as he was getting ready to share, this is how the translation was done. So just loads of material. That's not even counting hundreds and hundreds of sermons that we still have from the translators where they talk about individual text. We just have loads of data. It's certainly true. We don't have as much as we wish we had. We have lost some stuff. But when people come along and act like, well, we just have no idea how the King James was created, they're just not familiar with the data, I think, in most cases.
I wish we had more data on Acts 12:4.
I do too. Yeah, I wish we had a whole lot more on Acts. Acts is one of those really unique books. I think we have some form of draft work from every book of the New Testament except the Acts of the Apostles.
Yeah, except Acts.
There's that just doesn't exist. Maybe somebody will find it in a library someday. It could very well be stashed away somewhere. But right now we don't have any record of their working on the book of Acts. They did. But
I've been trying to put some stuff together for Acts 12:4 because I did a video on it like 10 years ago and I was like totally wrong. Like I was just like wrong. So I need to correct myself, and I'm trying to like pinpoint Acts 12:4 and how Easter got in there, and I can't find out why. I wish we had more. I won't say anything more because that is a video coming out sometime soon. I know I said soon before, but it's been an interesting study.